Across late medieval Europe, something striking and still not fully explained took place. Thousands of villages were gradually abandoned. Historians have long tried to understand why this happened, yet no single answer fits every region. On the European continent, these deserted settlements are often linked to declining populations and falling grain prices, trends that began to take hold during the 14th century. In England, however, the story has traditionally been told differently. There, village abandonment is often connected to landowners who enclosed open fields and shifted towards sheep farming, seeking higher profits after the mid-15th century. This contrast has led many scholars to describe England as an exception, where villages were not simply fading due to economic decline, but were actively reshaped or displaced by changing agricultural priorities. Yet this sharp distinction may be misleading. England did not exist in isolation, and it experienced many of the same pressures affecting the rest of Europe. Population losses, economic adjustments, and long-term shifts in land use all played a role across the continent, and England was no different. While landlords and enclosure certainly contributed to the disappearance of some villages, they were only part of a much broader transformation. Over time, rural society itself was changing. Fields were reorganized, farming practices evolved, and communities that had once been viable began to struggle. In this sense, the abandonment of English villages was not simply the result of deliberate actions by landowners, but also a consequence of deeper, long-term changes that reshaped the medieval countryside. Studying these vanished settlements is not straightforward. The surviving evidence is scattered and often incomplete, making it difficult to build a clear, continuous picture of what happened across the entire country. Instead, historians rely on detailed regional studies, piecing together local examples to understand broader patterns. One such region, the West Midlands, offers especially rich material. This area contains a remarkably high number of deserted village sites, with particularly dense concentrations in low-lying river valleys, clay plains, and certain upland zones like the Cotswolds. In contrast, woodland areas show far fewer signs of abandonment, suggesting that geography played an important role in determining which communities survived and which did not. Even within this region, the pattern is uneven. Some districts lost a significant portion of their settlements, while others remained relatively stable. In certain areas, entire clusters of villages disappeared, leaving large stretches of land without any permanent habitation. This uneven distribution highlights the complexity of the process. Desertion was not a single event or a uniform trend, but rather a series of local developments shaped by environmental conditions, economic pressures, and social structures. Although the West Midlands cannot represent all of England, its similarities with other central regions suggest that the patterns observed there reflect wider national trends. The disappearance of entire villages is only part of the story. In many places, settlements did not vanish completely, but instead shrank over time. Archaeological evidence reveals traces of former houses, scattered building materials, and fragments of pottery, indicating that once thriving communities gradually contracted. Some sites show dozens of abandoned dwellings, even in areas where settlement had been more dispersed, such as woodland regions. These findings suggest that depopulation was not limited to a particular type of landscape, but affected a wide range of rural environments. However, many of these smaller changes remain less studied, and their full significance is still not fully understood. To understand late medieval village abandonment, it is important to look further back in time. Settlement patterns in England had never been entirely fixed. Archaeological discoveries reveal that earlier communities, including those from the Anglo-Saxon period, were also abandoned at various points. In some cases, places recorded in early documents later disappeared entirely, leaving behind only faint traces in the landscape or in place names that no longer correspond to existing settlements. These earlier examples suggest that movement and change were always part of rural life. One key process behind these early shifts was the gradual concentration of scattered settlements into more compact villages. Over time, populations moved and reorganized themselves, forming the larger, more centralized communities that became typical of much of medieval England. As a result, some smaller or less favorable locations were left behind. This process shows that abandonment did not always signal decline. In some cases, it was a byproduct of growth, as people relocated to places offering better opportunities, leaving other sites to fade away. By the late 11th century, settlement patterns had become more stable, and many communities continued to exist for centuries afterward. However, even then, change had not completely stopped. Some places recorded in early surveys no longer appeared in later documents, or survived only as field names, rather than living communities. This suggests that the process of consolidation was still ongoing, with some settlements disappearing as others expanded or shifted. Landowners also played a role in reshaping the landscape, though their influence varied. In certain cases, villages were removed or relocated to make way for estates, parks, or monastic lands. Religious institutions, in particular, could acquire large areas and reorganize them for their own purposes, sometimes displacing existing communities. Individual landlords could also absorb tenant holdings into their own estates, transforming cultivated land into directly managed property. However, such actions rarely led to widespread or systematic abandonment across entire regions. In many cases, landlords preferred to maintain their tenants as they provided a steady source of income, while tenants themselves were often reluctant to leave due to limited access to land elsewhere. The early 14th century marks a decisive shift in the story of medieval rural life. Around the year 1300, the countryside began to change in ways that would shape the fate of countless villages over the next 2 centuries. Expansion slowed, and in many regions it came to a halt. Land that had once been cleared and cultivated was no longer maintained with the same intensity. Fields began to fall out of use, soil lost its productivity, and entire strips of arable land were quietly turned into pasture. Across many manors, records start to reflect a growing pattern. Empty holdings, struggling tenants, and plots of land left untouched because no one remained to work them. By the early 1340s, these pressures had become visible in certain areas with particular clarity. In parts of Gloucestershire and Oxfordshire, entire communities were already showing signs of distress. In some villages, large portions of farmland lay idle, sometimes reaching hundreds of acres. Elsewhere, tenants were described as too poor or too weak to sustain their obligations, while in other places people simply left, seeking better prospects beyond their home settlements. Some villages would later vanish entirely, but even at this early stage the warning signs were unmistakable. Fields went uncultivated, homes stood empty, and communities began to fragment from within. These difficulties did not appear suddenly. Earlier in the century, periods of crisis had already exposed the fragility of rural life. During times of famine, some villages were described as small, impoverished, and unable to sustain more than a handful of tenants. What makes these early examples significant is their location. Many of them were situated in regions that would later become centres of large-scale village abandonment. This suggests that what was happening was not a short-term disruption, but the early phase of a much longer transformation. The areas affected were not newly settled frontiers or marginal lands. On the contrary, they were long-established communities with reasonably productive soils. The problem lay elsewhere. In some cases, cultivation had been pushed too far, stretching the land beyond its limits. In others, the balance between farming and livestock had been disrupted, reducing soil fertility and making agriculture harder to sustain. Economic pressures also played a role. Rent demands, combined with frequent taxation, placed heavy burdens on tenants, weakening their ability to remain on their holdings. Over time, these combined pressures created a slow but steady erosion of rural stability. After the Great Plague of the mid-14th century, the evidence for village decline becomes much more widespread. The disease itself did not usually erase entire communities in a single blow, but it left many settlements severely weakened. With fewer people to work the land, some villages struggled to recover. In certain cases, the population never returned to previous levels, and the remaining inhabitants eventually drifted away. Sometimes, the plague simply accelerated a process that had already begun. Villages that had been declining before the outbreak were pushed beyond recovery, their remaining inhabitants disappearing within a few years. During the later 14th century, numerous villages began to show clear signs of abandonment or contraction. In some places, most tenants had already left, leaving behind only a few scattered households. Elsewhere, large numbers of holdings passed into the direct control of landlords, who chose to convert them into pasture rather than attempt to attract new tenants. This was not always a sudden transformation. In many villages, the process unfolded gradually, as empty plots accumulated, and the structure of the community slowly dissolved. Some settlements entered a prolonged period of decline that lasted well into the 15th century, even after the immediate effects of the plague had passed. Many villages retained only a fraction of their former population. Over time, the number of tenants continued to fall, sometimes over several generations. A village that once supported dozens of households might be reduced to a handful, and eventually to none at all. In some cases, land that had once been divided among many tenants was consolidated into a few large holdings, often managed as pasture rather than arable fields. The shift from cultivation to grazing marked a fundamental change in how the land was used, and it often signalled the final stage in a village's existence. The physical traces of these changes can still be seen in the landscape. Earthworks mark the outlines of former houses, and abandoned plots can be identified where cottages once stood. In some places, entire clusters of dwellings disappeared, leaving only faint impressions in the ground. Archaeological evidence shows that this process was rarely uniform. Different parts of the same village might be abandoned at different times, reflecting a gradual and uneven decline, rather than a single moment of collapse. Although this slow reduction in population and activity was widespread, it did not always attract attention at the time. Many villages continued to function, albeit in diminished form, and their decline was not always immediately obvious. However, by the later 15th century, a new phase began to emerge, one that was more visible and more controversial. Observers of the period began to comment on the disappearance of villages, often blaming landowners for driving out tenants and enclosing land for private use. These accusations were not entirely unfounded. In some cases, landlords did indeed reorganize their estates, converting arable land into pasture and removing the remaining inhabitants. There are examples where fields were enclosed, homes were abandoned, and communities were effectively erased. However, a closer examination reveals that many of these villages had already been in decline long before such actions took place. Enclosure and eviction often represented the final stage of a process that had been unfolding for decades. Official investigations into rural change, carried out in the early 16th century, provide further insight into this process. These records describe houses falling into ruin, tenants leaving their homes and ploughlands being replaced by pasture. Yet they rarely point to sudden, large-scale destruction. Instead, they capture the closing chapter of a much longer story, a gradual weakening of rural communities that had begun generations earlier. In many cases, the language used suggests that villages were not forcibly destroyed, but rather allowed to fade as populations dwindled and economic conditions shifted. It is also important to recognise that landlords were not always eager to see their villages disappear. In fact, many made considerable efforts to maintain their tenant populations. Some attempted to prevent migration, requiring tenants to remain on their holdings or compelling others to take over abandoned land. Others invested resources in repairing buildings, offering financial support or materials to ensure that houses remained habitable. These actions suggest that, for much of the period, landlords still valued the presence of tenants and the income they provided. Despite these efforts, maintaining rural communities became increasingly difficult. As opportunities elsewhere grew and mobility increased, tenants were less willing to remain tied to declining villages. Attempts to enforce obligations often failed, and over time, authorities began to accept that they could no longer control the movement of people as they once had. Even substantial investments in buildings and infrastructure were sometimes unable to reverse the trend. In some places, the struggle to preserve settlements became particularly intense. Orders were issued demanding repairs, penalties were imposed on those who neglected their responsibilities, and in certain cases, buildings were reconstructed at the expense of the landowner. Yet these measures were not always successful. By the later 15th century, some communities had reached a point where recovery was no longer possible. Efforts to enforce maintenance gave way to more general and less effective measures, reflecting a growing recognition that the decline could not easily be stopped. The abandonment of villages in late medieval England was therefore not the result of a single cause or a single moment of crisis. It was a long, complex process, shaped by environmental pressures, economic change, demographic shifts, and human decisions. In some cases, villages were actively transformed or absorbed into new forms of land use. In others, they simply faded away as their populations dwindled and their economic foundations eroded. Together, these abandoned settlements tell the story of a countryside in transition, where stability gave way to change and where the rhythms of rural life were quietly but profoundly reshaped over time. Landlords in the later Middle Ages were deeply anxious about the loss of rental income, and for that reason they rarely gave concessions unless pressure forced them to do so. In many places they tried to hold firm for as long as possible, but by the 15th century it had become clear that stubbornness could ruin an estate as easily as generosity could weaken it. Some estate officers openly warned that excessive demands would drive tenants away and leave manors in collapse. Elsewhere, when large numbers of holdings stood empty and the remaining villagers threatened to leave as well, rents had to be cut simply to keep the settlement alive. In villages already under strain, the old financial terms could no longer be sustained. Holdings that had once brought in respectable annual rents were let for sharply reduced sums, and the fees that new tenants normally paid to enter possession were often dropped altogether. In healthier communities, the old charges might still survive, but in declining places, landlords were clearly willing to sacrifice income in the short term rather than lose their tenant body completely. Their actions suggest that in most cases they did not want villages to disappear. This matters because the older idea of widespread, calculated depopulation assumes a class of landlords who were bold, fast-moving, and eager to reorganize the countryside at every opportunity. The evidence points to something more hesitant. Many landlords and their officials appear cautious, slow to act, and often uncertain about how to respond to a changing rural economy. Even the enclosure of land left vacant by departing tenants could take many years. Lesser landowners, especially members of the gentry, may have been more capable of adapting because they watched their estates more closely and had fewer resources to waste. When rent income fell, and a village was visibly weakening, some of them eventually chose to remove the last tenants and convert the land to enclosed pasture. Yet deserted villages were not found only on gentry estates. They also appeared on properties belonging to major lay lords and church institutions, groups not usually associated with rapid or adventurous economic change. That wider distribution suggests that village desertion cannot be explained simply as the aggressive policy of one social class. Another force in the countryside, less visible but often influential, was the farmer who leased and managed the lord's domain. These men could shape the fate of a settlement in powerful ways. In one village, the local vicar complained bitterly that the community was collapsing because the farmer was driving people out. Buildings were falling into ruin, cottages were disappearing, and land that villagers had depended on was being taken away from them. The complaint did not describe some distant theory of change. It presented a place that seemed to be approaching destruction in real time. The vicar argued that preserving an entire community mattered more than enriching a single man. Surviving manorial records from the same place support that picture. They show vacant holdings, ruined houses, and a village under serious pressure. In that case, the lord eventually replaced the farmer with local tenants as leaseholders, and the settlement survived. Cases like this raise the possibility that other Damascene farmers, less well documented, also pushed fragile villages closer to collapse. The fate of abandoned land after a village declined reveals how varied the process really was. If every desertion had been driven by a simple plan to evict tenants and turn fields into profitable grazing, the pattern would be much more uniform. Instead, many former village lands passed through long periods of uncertainty. Some fell into semi-waste and brought in only token rents. Grassland spread across former field systems, but it was not always organised immediately into efficient enclosed farms. Sometimes, neighbouring villagers grazed animals there on a modest scale. In places where several lords had claims in the same village, even the question of who owned the grazing rights could become confused after the community had vanished. Local memory had to be consulted in order to reconstruct customs that no longer had a living village to sustain them. Quite often, the landlord was not the first or even the main beneficiary of village decline. Land vacated by one household might be taken up by neighbours or by tenants from nearby settlements. In many shrinking villages, a few remaining tenants accumulated increasingly large holdings, as more and more land fell vacant around them. Holdings that once would have been divided among several families could end up concentrated in only one or two hands. This kind of accumulation is easy enough to imagine, but it raises another question: how such large units were managed in a countryside where labour was scarce. In some places, arable farming clearly continued, showing that these enlarged holdings were not automatically converted to pasture. Yet it is hard to believe they were always worked to their full potential. Some may have been underused, and some do not seem to have attracted eager successors when their holders died. Still, a strong tenant with extensive resources could alter the whole balance of a village. A dominant occupier, especially one focused on livestock, may have helped to hasten the departure of the remaining inhabitants. Land, accumulated by absentees, could also weaken a settlement, draining away both labour and social cohesion. Eventually, and sometimes only after many years of partial neglect or limited use, former village lands could be reorganised into highly productive enclosed units. Where enough capital and authority were available, the opportunity was obvious. Some landlords took direct control, consolidating large tracts into stock farms centred on sheep and cattle. These enterprises could become far more profitable than the older village economy had been. They required only a small workforce, supplied meat, dairy products, and wool and often generated striking increases in estate income. In other cases, landlords preferred to lease the enclosed pastures to outside operators. These lessees might be gentlemen, urban graziers, butchers, or ambitious entrepreneurs, building up commercial farming interests. Rents from such enclosed sites could rise far beyond what the same land had yielded in its final years as a struggling village. The transformation was not always immediate, and it was certainly not universal, but when it happened, it created a very different kind of rural landscape. One more concentrated, more market-oriented, and more dependent on pastoral production than on the older balance of village cultivation. To understand why some villages disappeared while others survived, it is not enough to examine landlords alone. The internal condition of peasant communities also mattered. Nearly every village in the later Middle Ages faced pressure. Population declined across a long period, stretching from the mid-14th century into the 15th, and in many places there was no real recovery until the early 16th century. Most settlements lost a large share of their people. Some, however, suffered much more severe decline than their neighbours. Plague was certainly part of the larger demographic crisis, but the differences between villages cannot be explained simply by disease, striking one place harder than another. Even severe outbreaks did not usually erase whole communities. The deeper issue was movement. Rural society became increasingly mobile, especially after 1400. As opportunities opened elsewhere and old manorial controls weakened, people left more easily and more often. Even stable villages saw families come and go over time, but in vulnerable settlements the turnover was far sharper. Names disappeared from the record with startling speed. Families that had once formed the backbone of a community vanished within a generation or two, and few holdings passed steadily from father to son. Instead, land changed hands rapidly, was surrendered to the lord, or stood empty between occupants. The surviving documents from some declining villages are full of these signs of instability. Holdings were given up, taken briefly, abandoned again, and inherited only rarely. This kind of transience suggests communities that were no longer rooted in the older patterns of continuity. The geography of survival was not random. Woodland zones and river valleys often seem to have retained population more successfully, while open field regions such as the Feldon of Warwickshire and the Cotswolds proved more vulnerable. The difference may lie in the farming systems on which those villages depended. In the Great Age of expansion, many of the open field communities had developed a highly specialised form of agriculture based on extensive arable cultivation under strict communal regulation. That system worked well when grain production was central. But as demand for grain weakened, especially from the late 14th century onward, rural producers increasingly turned toward more mixed farming with a stronger emphasis on pasture. In landscapes where enclosure and varied land use were already common, adaptation was easier. In heavily organised open field communities, change was harder to manage. That does not mean the open fields were completely rigid. Strips could be converted, small enclosures could appear, and grazing could expand. But each of these adjustments created tension. Boundaries, rights, and customary rules had to be renegotiated in a system designed for a different balance of land use. Court records from many villages show disputes over encroachment, neglect of boundary markers, and unauthorized occupation of land. In villages already in decline, these pressures seem to have been even more severe. Tenants appropriate strips they did not legally hold. Meadow and arable were enclosed bit by bit. Old field boundaries lost their force because the social fabric that had maintained them was weakening. Once that discipline began to loosen, the entire communal system became more fragile. Livestock created another source of strain. As more villagers and outsiders tried to expand grazing, common pasture came under pressure. In many manners, individuals were accused of keeping too many animals on land meant to support a broader community. Usually these disputes involved manageable numbers, but in some cases the scale was extraordinary. Large flocks could overwhelm the resources of a declining village and threaten its remaining balance between tillage and pasture. Where this happened, the transformation of the countryside was no longer gradual adaptation alone. It became a direct challenge to the village's ability to survive as a communal settlement. Yet even these pressures do not fully explain why some villages disappeared and others endured. The settlements that proved most vulnerable do not seem, in general, to have occupied especially poor soils. Most had farmed land of average quality and had existed successfully for centuries before decline set in. Their disappearance was not simply a retreat from bad land, nor can it be blamed on climate alone. Instead, certain shared characteristics hint at deeper weaknesses. Many of the villages that later vanished had always been relatively small. They were often not the main settlement in their parish, but secondary places of lesser status. Small size and low rank may have made them less attractive to both existing residents and newcomers. As population fell further, the balance of village life could become impossible to maintain. A community needed labourers, craftsmen, brewing, exchange, and everyday social interaction. Once numbers dropped too low, those ordinary functions began to fail. Signs of that weakening can appear in surprisingly small details. In one declining village, only a single brewer was still selling ale in the early 15th century, and later, even that trade disappeared. Such a detail may seem minor, but it points to a wider truth. A village was not only a collection of holdings, it was also a social organism held together by routine services, labour relationships, and shared daily life. When those disappeared, the incentive to remain weakened further. Proximity to other settlements also mattered. Many vulnerable villages stood very close to neighbouring communities. In such landscapes, the loss of one settlement could become part of a broader thinning out of an overcrowded rural pattern. If another village lay only a short distance away, migration became easier and survival less necessary. The social structure of tenure may also have affected vulnerability. In some cases, villages that later disappeared had a high proportion of unfree customary tenants before decline began. Such tenure was less attractive in a world where movement was becoming easier and opportunities elsewhere were growing. At the same time, the economies of these vulnerable places seem to have been heavily agricultural. Villages with significant cloth production or metalworking do not generally appear among the deserted settlements. Communities with broader economic bases may have had better chances of adapting to the pressures of the later Middle Ages, while those dependent almost entirely on farming were more exposed when the agrarian balance shifted. Even so, no single trait offers a complete answer. The most convincing explanation is a combination of pressures. Some villages were weaker because they were small, secondary, heavily dependent on open field cultivation, or limited in economic variety. Others may have survived similar disadvantages but were undone by circumstance. An aggressive landlord, a damaging Demean farmer, an absentee landholder, or a powerful tenant who upset the local balance. Chance, as well as structure, played its part. Although this picture emerges from one particular region, it is unlikely to be unique. Archaeology from other parts of England often points to the same broad pattern. Long, uneven decline, with final abandonment sometimes reached by the early 15th century, and sometimes after a prolonged fading away. Detailed documentary work in other counties may reveal local differences, but the wider forces at work were not confined to one landscape. Population decline, increased movement, pressure on open field agriculture, tension within village society and the weakening of seigneurial authority were all widespread features of the period. None of this should be read as a story of simple economic collapse. The disappearance of villages certainly meant loss, dislocation, and the end of long-established communities. But the abandoned land did not become useless. Fields no longer needed for grain could provide badly needed pasture. Neighbouring villages could make use of the grassland, and in some places those former village lands became the basis for large enclosed farms that were commercially efficient and highly productive. The old village landscape was shrinking, but a different rural economy was taking shape in its place. In that sense, village desertion was not only an ending, it was also part of a broader reorganisation of the English countryside, as medieval patterns of settlement gave way to a new agrarian world. One of the most familiar divisions in the English landscape is the contrast between regions of nucleated villages and regions where people lived in hamlets, farmsteads, or scattered clusters. This contrast was already established by the 12th century, and in some places it may go back several centuries earlier. A broad zone of village-based settlement stretched through the middle of England, running from the northeast down toward the southwest. On either side of that central belt lay landscapes dominated by more dispersed forms of habitation. Yet the pattern was never absolute. Hamlets and isolated farms could still be found inside village country, just as compact villages sometimes appeared in regions otherwise known for scattered settlement. The map was not divided by hard boundaries. What mattered was the prevailing form in each area, not an exact line. These contrasting settlement types were tied to equally distinct systems of farming. The large nucleated villages were usually associated with open fields, often arranged in the familiar two-field or three-field pattern. In the dispersed landscapes, by contrast, landholding was more often based on enclosed plots or irregular field systems. These differences shaped the look of the countryside for centuries. Earlier, writers described the open field districts as champion country and the more enclosed zones as woodland country. In one type of landscape, communal cultivation and broad expanses of ploughland dominated daily life. In the other, fields, pastures, and boundaries tended to be more varied, more irregular, and often more deeply rooted in older patterns. The great village communities of the 13th century depended heavily on extensive arable production, while dispersed settlements could support a wider range of economies, from intensive cereal farming in some eastern districts to strongly pastoral systems in upland and western regions. Although medieval villages have attracted a great deal of scholarly attention, the scattered settlements deserve no less. The regions dominated by villages covered less than half the country, and in the densely populated counties outside that zone, a very large share of the medieval population lived in landscapes without villages in the classic sense. There is another reason why dispersed settlements matter so much. Before the 9th century, most settlements in England were small. If large villages emerged comparatively late, then the study of areas that never fully embraced that process may help explain why nucleation happened in some places and not in others. Instead of treating dispersed settlement as a secondary or less developed form, it makes more sense to see it as a major and enduring part of England's rural history. Any attempt to understand a settlement pattern has to answer several basic questions. What forms did it take? When did it begin? How did it change over time? And why did it develop in the way that it did? In the case of nucleated villages, those questions have already been explored in considerable detail. Their plans have been examined closely, and it is now clear that some were laid out with remarkable regularity, with rows of houses arranged along streets or around greens, especially in the north. In the Midlands, where many settlements look more irregular, researchers have identified different plan types and shown that some larger villages may have grown out of the merging of several earlier settlement clusters. The date of village formation has also been narrowed. Large nucleated settlements appear to have emerged mainly between the 9th and 12th centuries. Yet even here there are important uncertainties. In many places, the small and scattered settlements that seem to have preceded the villages were abandoned in the 7th, 8th or 9th centuries, while the main phase of occupation in the later villages often seems to belong to the 11th and 12th centuries. That gap suggests a more complex process than a simple one-for-one transfer of population. It is also likely that the pace of village formation varied greatly from region to region. Some counties appear to have developed nucleated settlements earlier than others, which reminds us that no single national timetable can explain the whole story. After they formed, villages did not remain fixed. Many expanded and some changed their shape quite dramatically. Neighbouring settlements could merge into one larger village, while in other cases a single community might fragment into separate parts. From the 14th century onward, many villages began to shrink, sometimes altering their form as buildings disappeared and populations declined. A significant number vanished altogether. In that sense, the medieval village was not a static institution but a settlement type capable of growth, reorganization, contraction, and final abandonment. The reasons why villages formed in the first place remain debated. One explanation places the initiative mainly in the hands of landlords, arguing that villages and open fields were shaped to increase lordly power and improve returns from the land. Another emphasizes environmental pressures and the demands of a growing population. From that perspective, communities extended cultivation, organized the shared use of fallow and pasture, and settled more compactly in order to manage land more efficiently and fairly. This second view gives a more active role to peasant communities themselves in shaping their own fields and settlements. Yet neither interpretation solves every difficulty. If landlords were the main force behind village creation, it is hard to explain why areas of nucleation do not match neatly with the estates of the greatest lords. If population pressure alone produced compact villages, it is equally hard to understand why some of the most densely populated regions did not develop them on the same scale. Whatever their precise origins, there is little doubt about how these villages functioned at their height. Their inhabitants farmed according to shared rules, held land in standardized units, and lived within a framework in which individual choice was constantly balanced against communal obligation. When the same questions are asked of dispersed settlements, the answers become less certain. Their forms vary enormously. In some regions, houses stretched loosely along lanes or the edges of greens. Elsewhere, people lived in compact hamlets, and in other places again they occupied isolated farmsteads, set at some distance from one another. This diversity alone warns against any simple definition. Dispersed settlement was not one thing. It was a broad category that covered several quite different ways of organising rural life. Older views often treated scattered settlements as products of relatively late medieval colonisation, as though they were secondary additions to an older and more established village landscape. That interpretation has become much harder to sustain. Archaeology has shown that isolated farms and small hamlets were widespread not only in the medieval period, but also in the centuries before it, and indeed in prehistoric and Roman times as well. At least some medieval dispersed settlements may therefore represent the survival of very old patterns, rather than late inventions. In some cases, there is even reason to suspect that medieval farmsteads stood close to the sites of their Roman predecessors. The early medieval period seems to have been marked by considerable instability in settlement location and form. In some areas, small settlement groups developed into elongated rows of houses. In upland regions, permanent farms could grow out of places that had once been used only seasonally. Later, in the 14th and 15th centuries, dispersed settlements were affected by contraction just as villages were. Isolated farms could be abandoned, hamlets could disappear entirely, and clusters of houses could shrink until only a single farm remained. Yet even during these centuries of overall decline, some new isolated settlements were still being founded. That mixture of continuity, movement, decline, and occasional new growth makes the history of dispersed settlement especially difficult to reduce to a single model. Older explanations based on ethnic identity are no longer convincing. Dispersed settlements cannot simply be labelled as the survival of some distinct Celtic or British tradition, because they appear in many parts of England, including areas where such an explanation is implausible. A more useful approach is to examine their connection with enclosed and irregular field systems. In some places, those fields may have been created by gradual clearance during the medieval expansion of cultivation. In others, they may preserve structures inherited from the Roman countryside. These landscapes also tended to support farming systems, with a stronger pastoral element than was normally possible in a strictly regulated, open-field village. Without such rigid communal control, the inhabitants of dispersed settlements often had more room for individual decision-making in how they used land. The social structure of these regions could also differ from that of village country. They certainly included dependents and customary tenants, but they often supported a relatively high proportion of freeholders as well. Inheritance customs could be more varied, and rules other than strict primogeniture were more likely to be found outside the village zone. By the late 13th century, when the evidence becomes clearer, the population of dispersed landscapes also appears socially more mixed. Many smallholders lived there, but so did craftsmen and people whose livelihoods were not entirely agricultural. These communities have often been associated with greater independence of spirit. In later centuries, scattered settlement regions were more likely to be seen as difficult to control, more prone to rebellion, and more open to religious and political non-conformity. That image can be exaggerated because even dispersed settlements still operated within the framework of the parish, the vill, taxation, and legal obligation. Their fields may not have been governed by the same routines as open-field villages, but they still required collective arrangements over grazing, fallow, and common rights. A better understanding of dispersed settlement, therefore, depends on detailed local work. The parish of Pendock offers one such opportunity. It is well suited to field investigation because it combines pasture, where earthworks survive clearly, with arable land that can be walked for pottery and other finds. It is documented well enough to allow the landscape to be traced through time, and records from neighbouring manors help to fill some of the inevitable gaps. Its moderate size makes it manageable as a case study, and its location makes it easily accessible. Most importantly, Pendock appears to be an ordinary place, rather than a famous or exceptional one. It was not the centre of a great estate. It was not dominated by an urban market. Its land was not unusually rich or unusually poor. In that sense, it offers the chance to examine a landscape that may stand for many others like it. The parish itself has one unusual feature: its long-standing division into two separate parts. For clarity, these can be thought of as West Pendock and East Pendock. The method of investigation draws on every kind of evidence available, from aerial photographs and surviving earthworks, to pottery found in ploughed fields, surviving buildings, written records, and place names. Like so much landscape history, the reconstruction must move backward from what is visible and certain in the modern world, toward what is less certain in the medieval period and still more elusive in earlier centuries. But the story that emerges is best told in chronological order. beginning with the land itself and the earliest traces of human activity. Pendock lies in a part of Worcestershire that belonged not to the classic open-field champion country, but to the woodland landscapes that covered much of the county outside the Avon Valley and the plain east of Worcester. The district stands between the Malvern Hills and the River Severn. Compared with the steep slopes of the Malverns, it is low ground, yet it is far from flat. Small rises are broken by patches of former marshland, and Pendock itself occupies slightly higher ground along the western edge of Longdon Marsh. Once the largest wetland in Worcestershire, and not fully drained until the 19th century. The parish includes modest heights, stream divisions, and a natural pool known in earlier centuries by names that later evolved into Cromer Lake. Its reddish loamy and clayey soils are generally classed as being of average quality. Local opinion has often regarded East Pendock as the better land, and there is indeed more arable there, while West Pendock has more pasture. But that difference may reflect management and use as much as any natural contrast in the soil itself. This broader region once included woodland, open grassland, marsh, and significant tracts of forest. At the time of Domesday, extensive woodland was still recorded nearby, and in the 12th century, Pendock stood close to the southern edge of what had been royal forest, and later became a private chase. Administratively, it fell within the liberty of the Church of Worcester, although effective lordship on the ground rested with lay tenants who held the manor. Pendock also lay on routes of more than purely local significance. An east-west road linked the marsh crossing with places beyond the parish, and its line was later altered in the modern period. Another route, known in early sources simply as a street, may preserve the memory of a Roman road. A north-south route, running along the western edge of the parish, may also have ancient origins, forming part of a line that connected Gloucester with the Malvern region. These roads matter because they remind us that even a seemingly ordinary parish was never isolated from larger patterns of movement and exchange. Traditional history long imagined the lowlands of southwest Worcestershire as a region settled only in the early Middle Ages, a place once covered by forest and swamp and avoided by earlier populations. The evidence from Pendock makes that older picture much harder to maintain. Field walking has produced a thin but significant scatter of worked flints, mostly in East Pendock, suggesting activity in the Neolithic or Bronze Age. Place name evidence may preserve the memory of prehistoric barrows. In the Iron Age, nearby hill forts would have dominated the surrounding countryside, and Pendock must have fallen within the orbit of those defended centres of power. The Roman period is even more clearly represented. Roman pottery has been found across almost the whole modern parish. Some heavy concentrations point to likely settlement sites, while wider spreads may reflect the manuring of fields with domestic refuse or settlements now buried beyond the reach of the plough. Almost every ploughed field has yielded Roman material, except for very low-lying meadow or moorland, and a few hillier fields in the western part of the parish. Most of this pottery belongs to coarse local wares, with only a small number of finer imported or specialist vessels. That pattern suggests low-status rural settlements, rather than villas or wealthy farm complexes. Yet the presence of pottery from more distant production zones hints at wider market links connecting Pendock with towns and richer agricultural districts beyond the parish. These Roman finds cannot provide exact population figures. The settlement scatters are small, and there is no certainty that all were occupied at the same time. Some sites may still lie hidden beneath pasture. Even so, the sheer spread and quantity of Roman material make one point difficult to ignore. The Roman countryside of Pendock may have been at least as heavily used, and perhaps as densely occupied, as the same area in the high medieval period. Pottery survives for many reasons, and Roman ceramics are especially visible in the modern plough soil, so caution is necessary. Yet the comparison remains striking. The Roman period and the later Middle Ages stand out as two moments when the material signs of occupation and cultivation were especially strong, separated by centuries that appear much quieter in the archaeological record. That contrast alone makes Pendock a revealing place from which to explore the long and complicated history of dispersed settlement in England. When the Roman world faded, one of the clearest traces of everyday life began to disappear with it. Pottery had once been produced and distributed on a large scale, leaving behind a dense material record. After that system broke down, the countryside became much harder to read. Even so, the silence of the evidence does not mean the land was empty. In southwest Worcestershire, a British population almost certainly remained after Roman rule ended, and in the late 6th or early 7th century, that population came under Anglo-Saxon domination. The name Pendock seems to belong to that world. It was formed by Welsh speakers, and its meaning points to a hill and a barley field. The most convincing setting for that name is the ridge in East Pendock, where the medieval church would later stand. Though not the highest ground in the parish, it rises above the marsh in a way that would have made it especially striking. Even today, that plateau remains suitable for barley, and it is the part of Pendock most likely to have stayed under cultivation continuously from Roman times onward. Yet the broader picture after Rome is not one of continuity, but of withdrawal. In Pendock, as in several other woodland regions of England, the strongest impression left by the early medieval centuries is one of shrinking cultivation and returning woodland. The contrast with the Roman period is dramatic. Roman material suggests widespread use of the landscape, while by the time of Domesday, the area was known above all for its woods. The exact extent cannot be measured with certainty, but the woodland may have covered a huge proportion of the parish. The shift can even be traced in individual places. Fields that later had to be cleared in the 12th and 13th centuries had already seen Roman occupation, showing that land once settled and worked had fallen back into scrub or woodland before being reopened again. By the 10th and 11th centuries, Pendock and the neighbouring places around it functioned less as self-contained farming communities and more as wooded outliers attached to richer manors in the Avon Valley. The connection was part of a broader early medieval pattern in which arable cores were linked to distant woodland zones. Pendock was tied administratively to more productive estates at some distance, and those links seem to have been designed to support a regional division of labour. The communities in the better grain-growing districts concentrated on cultivation, while the more wooded dependencies supplied timber, fuel, and pasture. These arrangements are sometimes treated as ancient survivals from a very remote past, but the evidence from Pendock points in another direction. Roman finds suggest that the area had not been heavily wooded in late antiquity. The system of linking arable manors with remote woods looks more like an adaptation to the post-Roman world, when markets weakened and direct control over a range of local resources became more important. Those woods were not empty wilderness. They were managed landscapes. Timber, fuel, poles, and grazing all had to be organised, and the local road network reflects that reality. Pendock was connected not only to the wider routes running east and north, but also to tracks that would have served woodmen, herdsmen, and others working within the woodland economy. Early boundary descriptions evoke a landscape of streams, pools, and trees, but not an untouched one. They also mention hedges, open ground, enclosures, and clearings. Personal names attached to bridges, pools, and other landmarks suggest a countryside already shaped by use, memory, and occupation. By the later 10th century, Pendock was already moving along a familiar path seen in many woodland dependencies. A place once valued mainly for its resources was beginning to develop toward a more settled and independent village existence. That process did not begin from nothing. There is no good reason to think that all permanent settlement had vanished from East Penduk in the early medieval period. More likely, a small nucleus survived there throughout the centuries of retreat. Growth can be seen in stages. Land was leased to lay tenants, and named individuals emerge in the record over time, showing that the area was tied increasingly to secular control and local management. By the 11th century, Penduk had passed into the hands of powerful lay figures, though it still seems to have remained a small and not especially prosperous place. In one important lease, another settlement was included alongside Pendok, perhaps because its better arable land helped compensate for Pendok's limited resources. Even by Domesday standards, the population looks modest. The manor had only a small cultivated area and a small number of recorded workers and dependents. However the figures are interpreted, this was not yet a dense or highly developed farming community. The challenge is to turn these bare, administrative glimpses into an actual landscape. After the post-Roman retreat, Pendok probably formed part of a broader zone of woodland extending into the surrounding area. At some point in the early Middle Ages, it was divided from what would become neighbouring territories. The resulting arrangement was awkward. Both Pendok and its neighbour needed access to meadowland along the brook, and the final boundary seems to reflect bargaining, compromise, and uneven advantage. Penduk was left in two parts, while receiving a strip of meadow linked to its western half by a narrow corridor. Even that map is too neat, because later, evidence shows that the manor also held scattered parcels in several surrounding parishes. Some of these may have been acquired later, but they remind us that medieval territory was often messy, layered, and difficult to reduce to clean shapes on paper. The two parts of Pendok may even preserve an older division in lordship. The evidence strongly suggests that the lay manor of the 10th and 11th centuries was centred in East Pendok, where settlement had probably never disappeared entirely. The earliest medieval pottery recovered from the parish is concentrated there. It was also in the east that the church was established, likely as part of the wider spread of parish churches founded by secular lords from the late Anglo-Saxon period onward. The earliest surviving stonework belongs to the 12th century, and even if there had been an earlier building, it is unlikely to have stood on the site much earlier than that. The manorial centre must also have been nearby, making East Penduk the natural focus of lordship and worship alike. Some landscape features there may preserve the outline of an early lordly enclosure, though the evidence is not decisive. At the same time, it would be too simple to imagine East Pendok as the cultivated lay manor and West Pendok as nothing but woodland. Early references to ploughed land near the western side, together with later domain holdings there, suggest that some cultivation continued in both parts of the parish. By the late 11th century, then, Penduk seems to have consisted of a heavily wooded territory, already divided into two sections. One part probably functioned as a wood and pasture appendage, still linked to a larger manor elsewhere, while the other had become a small lay manor with its own developing centre. East Penduk likely contained the main cluster of dwellings, the accommodation of dependent labourers, and the base from which local officials or subtenants managed the estate. If anyone lived permanently in West Pendok, they may have been the kinds of people Domesday often overlooks. Custodians of woodland, supervisors of grazing, or rent-paying tenants who do not fit neatly into the categories the survey chose to record. The 12th and 13th centuries transformed this world. Cultivation expanded rapidly at the expense of woods and pasture, but this should not be imagined as settlement pushing into land that had never before been used. Much of the ground being cleared had already been farmed in Roman times, and perhaps even earlier. This was less the creation of a new landscape than the recovery of one long abandoned. Elsewhere in the region, woodland clearance on a large scale is well documented in the late 12th century, and Pendock was clearly part of the same movement. In East Pendock, cultivation spread northward into areas that had previously remained outside the main arable zone. In West Pendock, the process was even more dramatic, with large tracts brought back into use through clearance. As the cultivated area expanded, lordship and tenure became more complicated. The manor recorded in Domesday passed into the hands of a local gentry family that took its name from Pendock and established its residence near the church. Later, part of their land was granted to a priory, creating another local centre. Land that had once belonged to Worcester Priory and had previously been managed in connection with another manor came by the 13th century into the hands of a different family, whose estate centre also seems to have been based in East Pendock. Another religious landlord acquired holdings in West Pendock, and a separate local family amassed enough land there to build a moated house. The result was a parish crowded, not with one dominant manor alone, but with several small centres of lordship and residence. That multiplication of elite sites helped drive wider settlement growth. Peasant holdings also increased, and the number of occupied house plots rose sharply. Documentary evidence alone suggests a substantial number of messuages, though it almost certainly understates the real total because it is difficult to identify subtenants, cottagers, and others who left little fiscal trace. Archaeology, earthworks, surviving timber buildings, and the probable continuity of house sites into the modern period all point to a much larger number of dwellings at Pendock's medieval peak. Population estimates remain approximate, but the increase since Domesday must have been dramatic. Over the course of about 2 centuries, the number of inhabitants may have multiplied several times over, reaching a level comparable to the parish population many centuries later. The shape of medieval Pendock reflects this expansion. Rather than forming a single compact village, settlements spread along lanes in a loose network. Many of those lanes still survive, often marked by sunken tracks and old hedges. Houses stood at intervals along them, usually separated by pieces of cultivated land. The layout becomes clearest where later abandonment has preserved house platforms and hollow ways as earthworks. One major route ran north from the church toward the moor. Along it lay house sites, enclosed plots, patches of ridge and furrow, and areas where buildings once stood before being abandoned. Some sites continued in use into the later Middle Ages, while pottery suggests that settlement in this zone may already have begun by the 11th century. Another part of the parish, later known as Sledge Green, was originally not a compact hamlet, but a stretched settlement along the roadside. What looks clustered today is largely the result of later road changes and post-medieval rebuilding. In the Middle Ages, houses there were spaced out along a considerable distance with small agricultural plots between them. Some were abandoned by the late 15th century, while others survived much longer. In West Pendock, along Grafton Lane, a similar pattern appears, with moated enclosures, crofts, building platforms, patches of ridge and furrow, and houses spread along the route, rather than concentrated in a tight group. Another centre, Moor Court, sat in a low valley beside meadow and moor, combining a moated residence with a wider complex of agricultural structures and working spaces. The best way to describe Pendock's main settlement form is as a series of interrupted rows. The word row captures the roadside alignment of the houses, but they were interrupted, because each dwelling stood apart from the next, separated by crofts, closes, or pieces of working land. Houses often stood on both sides of a road, yet they rarely faced each other directly in a neat line. The parish contained several such rows, along with a few more isolated sites like Moor Court. Some of these rows may have originated beside former commons or newly assarted land, with houses set along the edge of pasture in a way that recalls green edge settlements elsewhere in England. As the number of settlements increased, cultivation spread until by the 13th century it covered almost all of the parish that could reasonably be ploughed. Written records speak of fields, crofts, and furlongs under the plough. Earthworks of ridge and furrow survive especially well in modern pasture, and older aerial photographs show even more of it than can now be seen on the ground. Medieval pottery scattered thinly across modern plough soil confirms the broad extent of manured arable. Taken together, these traces show that almost every part of Pendock, outside the low meadows and the wettest marshes, was cultivated at some point in the Middle Ages. Not all of this land was equally good. Some fields later reverted to pasture, and even medieval field names hint that certain areas were wet or poor. But the overall transformation was profound. Common pasture survived only in limited forms, especially along roadsides and on the moor, while woodland had all but disappeared from the parish itself. That loss of woodland is especially striking when compared with Pendock's earlier character. By the late Middle Ages, local documents no longer refer to woodland within the parish. Trees remained in hedgerows and on a few steep slopes, and some place names preserved the memory of former groves. But most of the timber and fuel resources now had to come from outside. Pendock had, in effect, completed the transition from woodland dependency to arable-based village landscape so thoroughly that it depended on a detached wood beyond its own bounds to meet its basic needs. Over the course of more than 1,000 years, the area under cultivation seems to have moved in a broad cycle. In the Roman period, much of the parish appears to have been settled and farmed. In the early Middle Ages, that cultivated area contracted sharply as woodland and rough land spread again. By around 1300, cultivation had expanded once more to a level that may have matched, or nearly matched, that of the Roman period. In other regions of England, continuity between Roman and early medieval farming was stronger, and the later medieval expansion was therefore less dramatic. Pendock offers a different story, one that may be typical of some woodland zones. Not steady continuity, but retreat followed by renewed growth. The medieval arable landscape that emerged wasn't organised in the regular pattern familiar from the classic open-field villages. Pendock's fields were irregular in shape and uneven in size, and there is no sign of a neat rotational structure. Holdings were scattered across different fields in what seems at first almost random fashion. The distinction between a field and a croft was often blurred. Some crofts, like larger fields, could contain strips worked by different tenants, while others were small enclosed plots, held separately by one person. A typical holding might combine a house with an adjacent croft, and this can still be imagined in the interrupted rows, where spaces between messuages were filled by plots used either as arable or pasture. In other words, Pendock's inhabitants worked a mixed landscape of small enclosures and larger shared areas, rather than the standardised open field system of the Champion country. Some of the biggest open areas survived without final enclosure until modern times, preserving for centuries the old irregular structure of a parish, whose history had always followed a path different from that of the classic nucleated village. Without the neat structure of the classic Midland open field system, farming in a place like Pendock must have depended on constant negotiation. Instead of one tightly ordered village acting as a single unit, smaller groups of neighbours had to agree among themselves about rotations, grazing rights, and the use of fallow land. It was a more flexible arrangement, but not necessarily an easier one. The people of Pendock did not enjoy the simple advantage of living entirely within their own compact holdings. Most households may have had a croft beside the house, but much of their land lay elsewhere, scattered across distant parts of the parish. Some tenants held strips and parcels in both East and West Pendock. and even the lord's own domain stretched across the two halves. For the people who worked this landscape, daily life must have involved constant movement. Tending crops, watching livestock, and keeping track of far-flung holdings required just as much travel and effort as life in a nucleated village. Penduk's society was not tightly gripped by lordly authority, yet that did not make it equal. It was a community marked by sharp divisions of wealth and status. In the 11th century, the manor seems to have relied on a small labour force made up of slaves and a few modest tenants. Later generations may have descended from these dependent people, becoming the customary tenants who paid relatively high rents for small amounts of land. But the real growth of Pendok after Domesday came from somewhere else. New settlers arrived and took up land as free tenants, usually on much lighter terms. These were the people who occupied most of the scattered houses that spread across the parish. Their surnames often came from the landscape itself, linking them to moors, slopes, hills, clearings, and newly won ground. Some of them had cleared woodland for cultivation, while others acquired plots that had only recently been opened up. In time, a few of these families built up large and prosperous holdings. By the late 13th century, certain names appear again and again among the more prominent people of the Ville. They paid a large share of royal taxes, witnessed local agreements, and served on juries. At the other end of the scale stood a far larger number of smallholders, people who held only a house and croft, a few acres, or so little land that their low rents are almost the only sign of their existence. Between these extremes stood a modest middle group, farmers with enough acreage to live above bare subsistence, but still overshadowed by two very large holdings centred on major manorial sites. Those two estates seem to have controlled much of the parish's agricultural wealth. Even so, Penduk's records often suggest that many tenants, rich and poor alike, also held land outside the parish. Some of the more prosperous names can be traced in nearby villages, and even the smaller occupiers may have been less poor than their tiny Penduk plots alone would imply. This was a community whose people were not confined neatly within one set of parish boundaries. That social inequality was tied closely to the market. Woodland districts often felt commercial influences more strongly than the more rigid open-field villages, and Penduk seems to fit that pattern well. Nearby places show clear links with larger towns, and at least some Penduk tenants were paying fines connected with trading in urban centres. Large leasehold farms could not have met their rents without producing a substantial surplus for sale beyond the village itself. The pottery tells much the same story. Most of it came from nearby production centres, which points to local trade, but some wares came from further afield, showing that Penduk was not cut off from wider exchange. The same outward-looking economy appears in the built environment. The parish still preserves traces of skilled carpentry, including timber-framed structures of a quality that suggests specialist craftsmen were at work there. Even a modest rural parish was connected to wider networks of labour, exchange, and expertise. Yet neither commercial activity nor social inequality prevented the growth of a functioning local community. Pendok still had to organise itself. Leading villagers were responsible for assessing and collecting taxes owed to the crown. Church wardens had to be chosen and supported, and the parish church must have provided one of the strongest points of unity in a scattered landscape. Roads had to be maintained, ditches kept clear, and common resources defended. Like the inhabitants of neighbouring places, the people of Penduk would have been expected to resist encroachments on shared grazing and to act together when outside interests threatened local rights. Even in a dispersed settlement, the need for collective action remained strong. Like the rest of rural England, Penduk did not escape the crises of the late Middle Ages. The disasters that struck nearby communities in the mid-14th century reveal just how severe the pressures could be. plague carried off large numbers of tenants. Flooding ruined meadows. Wet weather damaged crops. Buildings were destroyed by fire, and even the demands of royal officials could add to local hardship. Tithe receipts fell sharply, reflecting a decline in production. But these dramatic events were only part of a much longer process. Over time, population declined and farming shifted away from arable cultivation toward pasture. By the early 15th century, Pendock was already counted among the smaller settlements for tax purposes, suggesting that a major part of its population had gone. Later records indicate a much reduced number of households, and by the 16th century the total population seems to have fallen to a little over 100. In broad terms, Pendock followed the same demographic path seen across much of England, with a decline of well over half from its medieval height. This shrinking population left clear marks on the landscape. Many former house plots were abandoned. Some survived only as empty tofts, the sites of former dwellings where the buildings had disappeared. Others were occupied by tenants who held several properties at once, leaving some structures vulnerable to neglect. A few belonged to absentees whose main homes lay in other villages. The physical remains still tell the story. Earthworks mark the sites of abandoned houses, and concentrated scatters of pottery reveal places where occupation ended at different moments over a long span of time. Some houses seem to have been deserted in the 14th century, others in the 15th, and at least one remained in use until after 1600. The retreat of settlement did not stop there. Even in more recent centuries, buildings disappeared, and sites shown on early 19th century maps have since vanished. Pendock was not a place where abandonment happened all at once. It was a slow, uneven, almost continuous process. Even so, decline did not mean complete collapse. Pendock was not deserted in the way some villages were. Tenants remained, fields continued to be worked, and arable farming did not simply give way everywhere to grass. What emerges instead is a pattern of restructuring. Formerly separate holdings were merged. Tenements were absorbed by neighbours. Manors that had once existed side by side were gradually brought together under unified lordship. As that process continued, some old messuages lost their purpose. Even the manor house of the original de Pendock family became redundant. Over time, the balance of importance within the parish shifted, and other residences such as Moor Court and Prior's Court became the dominant houses of the community. In more recent centuries, movement within the parish itself accelerated. This reflected changing land ownership, enclosure, and the growing number of inhabitants whose lives were no longer tied directly to farming. Some areas, especially near the medieval church, lost population, while new clusters of settlement formed elsewhere. Sledge Green in the east became more concentrated, and another focus developed near the crossroads by Cromer Lake in the west. So strong was this shift that by the late 19th century, a new wooden church was built in the western part of the parish, closer to where people now lived. A century later, the old medieval church had lost its central role. The centre of gravity of Pendock had moved. The text then turns from settlement and society to another question that opens a window into medieval life from a very different angle: food. For all that is known about medieval agriculture, there is still surprising uncertainty about what ordinary people actually ate, especially those in the lower ranks of society. Diet matters because it allows social differences to be understood in material terms. Labels such as labourer, peasant, and gentry mean more when they can be connected to different standards of living and access to food. A clearer picture of nutrition could also help test wider arguments about demographic history, including the idea that poor diet among large parts of the population in the early 14th century helped to end a long phase of expansion and usher in a period of stagnation. More broadly, understanding what crops were consumed and in what form can illuminate the aims and structure of agricultural production itself. The problem is that diet is rarely visible directly. It usually has to be reconstructed from indirect evidence. Grain allowances granted to retired peasants, rations given to servants, bones and plant remains recovered from rubbish deposits, and other traces that reveal only fragments of the whole picture. These sources are valuable, but each carries its own limitations. They illuminate parts of the diet rather than the full menu, and they often leave room for uncertainty in interpretation. One especially useful body of evidence comes from the records of food and drink supplied to harvest workers. These accounts offer a rare glimpse of lower-class consumption across a long stretch of time, from the mid-13th century to the mid-15th. For that reason alone, they deserve close attention. But harvest workers were not average labourers in every respect, and their place within the wider hierarchy of medieval living standards needs to be considered carefully. Their meals reveal something important, but they have to be set in context. On many manors, harvest labourers were paid in cash alone. On others, especially in southern and eastern England, they received both cash and food. The workforce that gathered in the fields included the permanent servants of the manor, who during harvest were often paid differently than at other times of year, receiving meals instead of their usual grain allowances. They worked alongside temporary labourers hired specially for the harvest, some for the whole season and some for shorter bursts. Supervisors and administrators were present as well. In some places, the group eating at the Lord's table included reeves, haywards, herdsmen, dairymaids, and cooks, along with extra hands brought in for the most demanding weeks. The cook was often a regular employee, while a dairymaid might help with preparing food. In other words, the harvest workforce formed a temporary but complex social body, combining permanent staff, hired labour, and local authority. The work itself was exhausting. Harvest meant long days of cutting grain with sickles, binding sheaves, loading carts, hauling the crop back to the manor, and stacking it safely. The pace could become intense when bad weather threatened. Every observer of pre-modern harvest labour emphasises its severity. It was one of the most physically demanding periods in the agricultural year, and employers had every reason to feed workers well if it helped them sustain the pace. Harvest also brought fierce competition for labour. Lords, farmers, clergy, and prosperous peasants all needed workers at once. People left their homes and usual occupations in search of higher wages in the fields. Even before the Black Death, communities were trying to stop able-bodied people from leaving for better offers elsewhere. After the plague, when labour became scarcer, the competition grew sharper. Workers were accused in court of demanding excessive wages, breaking contracts and taking advantage of the season to secure better terms. Daily wages rose sharply during harvest, and some employers also offered lump sums and extra inducements to recruit labour for the whole period. Because harvest workers were such a special case, their diet was almost certainly better than that of labourers in ordinary times. Employers had a strong incentive to provide ample food. A workforce that was well fed would be more willing, more efficient, and more likely to return in later years. Yet the special nature of harvest should not make this evidence seem useless. The season lasted for several weeks, not just a single feast day, and that made it a meaningful part of working life rather than a brief exception. More importantly, the workers themselves came from a remarkably broad range of backgrounds. Among the permanent manor servants were younger people at the beginning of their working lives, but also older and more settled figures, including married labourers and widowed women. The temporary workers included smallholders, family members, and people who normally worked in other occupations such as building or textiles, but left those trades for the better rewards of harvest. Townspeople joined the labour force too, and some workers came from considerable distances. Records mention migrants from Wales as well as foreigners from across the Channel. Men and women both worked in the fields. A few better-off peasants appeared in supervisory roles because of the offices attached to their tenures. Above them stood the sergeant or bailiff, often drawn from a somewhat higher social level, and from time to time a monk or senior estate official might appear briefly to inspect the work. Even so, those occasional visitors did not greatly alter the character of the meals consumed by the main body of the labour force. In social terms, the harvest workers formed a wide and revealing sample. Villagers and townspeople, men and women, local people and migrants, agricultural labourers, and those normally employed elsewhere, the partly settled and the fully itinerant. Most stood low in the social hierarchy, but together they represented much of the working population. At first glance, the evidence might seem distorted by the fact that many surviving harvest accounts come from monasteries and other major landlords, places where customs of generosity or paternal care are often associated with harvest. That raises an obvious question. Were such accounts simply recording the unusual abundance provided by especially benevolent employers? The balance of evidence suggests not. Similar diets appear in records from the estates of minor lords, small monasteries, and gentry households. Great landlords were also highly conscious of cost, and their officials watched expenses closely. They were operating in the same labour market as everyone else. Peasant employers and seigneurial ones alike had to offer terms that workers would accept, and when both paid a daily wage together with food, the payments in kind were likely to have been roughly comparable. For that reason, harvest diets, while exceptional in some ways, still offer one of the clearest windows into the standard of living of medieval labourers at work. Sedgeford offers one of the clearest windows into the food of medieval harvest workers because its manner accounts survive in an unusually long and detailed run. These records were kept for Norwich Cathedral Priory, a landlord known for careful administration, and they preserve the annual section dealing with harvest expenses in a form that is especially useful. Cash payments are listed with precision, and many of the food supplies can also be traced through the manor's own stock and produce. Even so, these documents are not perfect mirrors of reality. Medieval officials were not above inflating costs, and the harvest accounts seem to have been checked closely, corrected, and argued over. That tension between manor officials and auditors is actually reassuring. The auditors clearly watch the figures with care, sometimes calculating how much bread 1 bushel of grain ought to provide, or how much food should be consumed by one worker in a day. The numbers may have been pushed upward at times, but they were not invented out of nothing. There are, however, other limits to the evidence. Some food came from the manor itself and cost no cash, so it can be difficult to measure fully. Vegetables from the garden rarely appear in the accounts for exactly that reason. The records also say very little about who ate what. Meat might include poultry, doves, and better cuts that were probably reserved for supervisors rather than shared equally. More importantly, the documents list those officially fed, not necessarily all those who benefited. The quantities involved are so large that at least some of the food must have been passed on to helpers, dependents, or family members. In later centuries, harvest work was often done by small family teams, and there is every reason to suspect something similar here. The food recorded for the harvest household probably reached a circle wider than the names written in the account. Sedgeford itself stood in the good sandy country of northwest Norfolk. Before the Black Death, the manor sometimes sowed more than 400 acres, though that figure later fell sharply. Its fields produced mainly barley, along with wheat, rye, peas, and oats. The domain also kept a varied stock of animals, including a dairy herd, pigs, poultry, and a large flock of sheep. During harvest, between 20 and 50 full-time workers might appear on the payroll. Taken together, the manor's resources and its careful records make it an ideal place for tracing changes in food consumption over time. The broad pattern that emerges is striking. In the 13th century, the harvest diet was dominated by cereals. Bread, pottage made from oatmeal, and ale formed the core of what workers received. Over time, that balance shifted. Gradually, the proportion of the food budget devoted to bread and other cereal-based provisions declined, while meat, fish, and dairy products became more important. This was not just a peculiarity of one Norfolk manor. Similar trends appear on estates in other counties. The details vary, but the same movement can be seen repeatedly. Less dependence on bread as the overwhelming foundation of the meal, and a steady rise in what contemporaries would have regarded as the foods that went with bread. At some manors, the change was dramatic. Bread that had once accounted for about half of the value of food issued to workers fell to a much smaller share over the course of the 14th and 15th centuries. At the same time, meat rose from a modest supplement to a major element in the harvest diet. In other places, the shift was less dramatic but still clear. Cereal foods remained essential, but they no longer monopolized the meal to the same degree. The result was not the abandonment of bread, pottage, or ale, but a more varied and richer combination of foods than had been typical earlier. Another important change can be seen in how grain was used. Over time, a greater share of cereal supplies seems to have gone into brewing ale rather than baking bread. Ale became an increasingly significant part of the workers' provisions. On some southern manors, cider had once played a major role, sometimes even rivaling ale, but by the later 14th century, ale had become much more dominant there as well. This change mattered not only because it altered the balance of the diet, but because it shows how closely food and drink were tied to local conditions, custom, and changing standards of labour reward. Within the category of non-cereal foods, the composition also shifted. Meat became more prominent, while dairy products tended to lose some of their earlier importance. Fresh meat increasingly replaced older patterns, based more heavily on bacon or preserved animal foods. In Norfolk, one can trace a move from bacon toward fresh beef. Elsewhere, mutton entered the harvest diet and then became a regular feature. On some manors, fresh beef was introduced later as another important addition. Poultry remained a smaller but steady presence, especially geese, which were closely associated with the season. Geese fed on the stubble after harvest, and then became part of the festive or privileged food of the period. That improvement in the meat allowance should not be romanticised too far. Harvest workers were rarely given the choicest animals. The accounts make it plain that the beasts slaughtered for them were often old, worn out, barren, weak, or otherwise no longer of great value to the manor. Manor officials sometimes seem almost anxious to explain this, as though defending themselves against any charge that good stock had been wasted on labourers. The workers might receive cattle too old for work, sheep culled from the flock, or poor quality animals no longer useful for breeding or milk. Offal also formed part of the food supply. So although the amount of meat increased, its quality was not necessarily what a modern reader might imagine. It was an improvement, but within the practical limits of estate management. Fish remained important too, especially in preserved forms, such as salted white fish and herrings. On some manors, fresh fish also appeared in the harvest season. Pottage, meanwhile, continued as a regular and familiar dish. It was based on oatmeal and sometimes enriched with peas or beans. Beyond that, the exact contents are often hard to recover. Vegetables like onions, leeks, or other garden produce probably went into it, but because they came from the manor's own garden and involved little direct spending, they usually went unrecorded. their silence in the accounts is revealing. It suggests not that vegetables were absent, but that they were seen as a minor background component, rather than a major part of the food economy. They added flavour and substance, but they did not occupy the same place in the minds of estate officials as grain, ale, meat, or fish. The way harvest workers were fed also reflects a larger domestic organisation. On some estates, they ate in the manor hall. In other cases, additional buildings were used when the labour force was especially large or when work extended to related tasks such as collecting tithes. The workers ate from wooden utensils, though some manors also used linen tablecloths and other modest refinements. These details remind us that the harvest meal was not just a matter of nutrition. It was also a structured social event, shaped by hierarchy, custom, and the effort of the Lord to manage and motivate a temporary labour force. The chronology of dietary change is especially important. It would be easy to assume that the Black Death was the great dividing line, and that harvest workers ate one way before the plague and another way after it. The evidence suggests a more gradual story. At Sedgeford, signs of change appear before the Great Epidemic. Bread was already beginning to decline in relative importance by the early 14th century, and better grains were beginning to replace barley. Other Norfolk manors show the same pattern even more clearly. Meat was increasing before the plague, and the replacement of coarser bread grains by rye and wheat was already underway. Fresh meat appears in records before the demographic catastrophe of 1348 and 1349. In this respect, the Black Death did not suddenly create a new diet. It intensified and accelerated tendencies that had already begun. Even after the plague, the transformation was not immediate. The full shift toward a diet less dominated by cereals, more reliant on fresh meat, and increasingly based on wheat, took decades to work through. The best harvest diets seem to belong not to the years immediately after the first epidemic, but to the 15th century. In other words, this was a long adjustment rather than a sudden break. Standards of consumption improved over time, but the process was uneven and stretched across generations. Short-term conditions also mattered. Bad harvest years could force manorial managers to make adjustments. When grain prices rose sharply, they did not necessarily reduce the total quantity of food given to workers, but they did alter its composition. More expensive grains might be replaced by cheaper ones. Grain that might otherwise have gone into ale could be redirected into bread. Non-essential animal products could be cut back. Yet even in difficult years, employers often still provided substantial food because harvest labour remained too important to neglect. If the crop was valuable, feeding workers well was still seen as worth the cost. That response is significant. Manor managers were not indifferent to labour productivity, and they understood that underfeeding workers during the most demanding season could be self-defeating. This helps place harvest diets in the wider social landscape. Independent wage earners and poor peasants must also have changed their consumption in bad years, but probably in harsher ways. They may have reduced or eliminated ale and animal foods altogether when resources were tight. The manor, by contrast, could absorb some of the shock and maintain a better standard for those working directly in the harvest. That does not mean harvest workers enjoyed comfort by modern standards, but it does mean their seasonal diet stood above the daily norm of many labouring people. So the value of the Sedgeford accounts lies not only in their detail, but in what they reveal about medieval society more broadly. They show a workforce fed well enough to sustain intense labour, but not treated lavishly. They reveal a diet still grounded in bread and ale, yet increasingly enriched by meat, fish, and dairy produce. They show gradual improvement rather than sudden transformation, and they expose both the flexibility and the limits of manorial provision in the face of crisis. Most of all, They bring the harvest season into focus as a moment when labour, food, hierarchy, and economic calculation all came together. In those few weeks each year, the medieval countryside revealed something essential about how it fed its workers, how it valued their effort, and how changing standards of diet reflected deeper changes within the rural world. The food given to harvest workers can tell an important story, but it would be a mistake to treat it as the normal diet of ordinary medieval people throughout the year. The meals served during harvest were unusually generous and belonged to a special moment in the rural calendar. They reflected the intense demand for labour, the physical strain of the work, and the competition among employers who needed willing hands in the fields. Because of that, harvest workers often ate far better in those weeks than they did during the rest of the year. Their food can reveal change over time, especially the movement away from an overwhelmingly cereal diet toward one with more meat and other additions. But it cannot simply be taken as the standard daily fare of the lower classes as a whole. The contrast becomes especially clear when the harvest diet is compared with what the same people received outside the harvest season. On many manors, some of those fed at the Lord's table in autumn were the permanent servants of the estate. For the rest of the year, these workers usually lived on grain allowances and modest cash wages, and those allowances were plainly inferior in both quality and quantity to what they received during harvest. In Norfolk, for example, servants continued to receive barley long after harvest workers had begun to eat increasing amounts of rye and wheat. Their annual allowances rose somewhat during the upheavals of the 14th century, but even then they remained slightly worse than the weekly grain available during harvest. And once the season ended, their cash wages were nowhere near enough to buy the same levels of ale, meat, fish, and dairy produce that had been available in the fields. Similar contrasts appear across the country. At some manors, workers who ate fine wheat bread during harvest lived for the rest of the year on coarser grains, mixed cereals, peas, or barley. These routine allowances strongly suggest that the ordinary diet of agricultural wage labourers was much poorer than the special diet of harvest time. Peasants who lived from their own produce probably also ate less well than harvest workers during the autumn, even if their diet shared some basic features with it. There are signs of overlap. In some areas, the mixtures of wheat, rye, or barley consumed by harvest workers resemble the grain allowances granted to retired peasants under maintenance agreements. Before the Black Death, the heavy use of dairy produce and bacon in harvest meals also fits what is known of peasant consumption. But any resemblance has limits. Better-off peasants with a cow or two could produce some milk and cheese, yet nothing on the scale made available to a group of harvest labourers, fed from the resources of a domain. If dozens of workers had access to the output of many cows during the season, a peasant household with only one or two animals had to stretch its dairy products much more carefully across the year. The richest peasants may have eaten better during harvest and may even have offered similar meals to their own workers in order to compete for labour. But that does not mean they maintained such standards in ordinary times. Their advantage lay more in security than in abundance. A peasant household with land at least had some continuing access to food, while many temporary harvest workers had no guarantee of employment once the season ended. That distinction mattered even more in bad years, when smallholders could not produce enough and lacked the cash to buy much more. One useful way to compare diets is to look at the balance between cereal foods and what accompanied them. After the changes of the 14th century, harvest workers often seem to have reached a rough balance between the two, with bread, pottage, and ale standing on one side, and meat, fish, and dairy produce on the other. That placed them well above many institutional poor and above some groups of labourers in other trades. Building workers and hired transport workers, for example, often seem to have eaten on a noticeably poorer balance than harvest labourers. Before the Black Death, the distance between harvest workers and the aristocratic or clerical elite was much greater. Comparisons with the meals of a prioress and her household show the difference clearly. The upper ranks enjoyed far more meat, fewer cereals in proportion, and additional luxuries that never appeared in the workers' rations. Yet by the 15th century, harvest diets had improved enough to narrow part of that gap. They still did not match elite standards, but they had moved closer to the lower levels of clerical or minor gentle consumption than they had been a century earlier. This places harvest labourers in an unusual position. During the autumn, they formed something like an aristocracy of labour. Their meals were far superior to the diet of ordinary agricultural workers for most of the year. In some cases, they also seem to have eaten better than other classes of wage earners, and to have approached, though not equalled, the standards of more secure peasant households. The harvest season temporarily lifted them into a distinct category. That did not make them prosperous in any lasting sense, but it does mean that the food they received must be interpreted as a seasonal high point, rather than a reliable daily norm. Even so, the direction of change in harvest diets does reflect broader developments in medieval society. The rise in the quality of food given to harvest workers was not entirely isolated. Permanent servants also began to receive better grain, especially a higher proportion of wheat, in the late 14th and 15th centuries, even if they rarely reached a fully wheat-based diet. Contemporary complaints by clerical and gentle observers about servants demanding good ale and hot fresh meat suggest that expectations were changing more widely among the labouring population. Other evidence points in the same direction. The shift in agriculture from arable to pasture after the mid-14th century would have increased the supply of meat, while the growing professionalisation of brewing suggests that ale consumption may also have expanded. Harvest diets, then, are exceptional, but they still reveal larger movements in standards of living and patterns of consumption among the lower ranks of society. The discussion then moves to a different but closely related subject: freshwater fish. Here too, medieval life is often misunderstood. Ponds survive widely in the landscape, but written evidence about their use is much thinner, and that imbalance has encouraged myths. It is easy to imagine that villagers built ponds for their own food, or that monasteries depended on fish, because their diet was uniquely restricted. Some also assume that inland fish production was essential simply because sea fish could not travel far from the coast, or that fasting rules by themselves explain the whole scale of freshwater fish consumption. The reality looks rather different. Freshwater fish belonged first and foremost to aristocratic consumption. Fish ponds are found most often beside moated houses, castles, monastic sites, and within parks. Their construction and maintenance required wealth, organisation, and specialist labour that ordinary peasants could never have afforded. The cost of managing ponds makes that point unmistakable. Even a single episode of cleaning or enlarging a pond system could absorb sums equal to the value of a large herd of cattle or years of skilled wages. Building and maintaining ponds required earth-moving, carpentry, sluices, pipes, and complex water control. It also demanded management beyond the pond itself, including the transport of breeding stock over long distances. All of this lay far beyond peasant resources. Village ponds that appear in documents or survive in the landscape were usually meant for watering animals, not for serious fish culture. Fish ponds as productive food resources belong to kings, great lords, bishops, monasteries, knights, and the gentry. These groups formed only a tiny minority of the population, but their incomes allowed them to consume food on a scale impossible for ordinary people. That aristocratic context matters because fish occupied a specific place within elite diet. Upper-class households ate large quantities of animal protein, far more than most of the population, and fish was an important part of that pattern. Religious rules did play a role. Meat was forbidden not only during Lent, but also on many regular fast days and vigils. For poorer people, that restriction did not make much difference, because meat was never a daily expectation. For aristocratic households, however, it created a constant need for alternatives. Freshwater fish helped meet that need, not simply by providing nourishment, but by offering variety. Wealthy households expected meals made up of several dishes, and fish contributed to that diversity of texture, taste, and display. The main evidence for this comes from aristocratic household accounts. These survive in large numbers, but they vary in usefulness. Some mention fish only in passing, especially when fish taken from a lord's own ponds, or given as gifts, did not involve purchase. Such records can be frustrating, because they hint at fish consumption without revealing its scale. More informative are the accounts that assign values even to fish supplied from domain ponds or received by other means. A good example comes from the household of a late medieval bishop, whose records show both purchased sea fish and freshwater fish drawn from his own stock. On a typical fast day, the household might consume salted fish, dried cod, fresh salmon, butter, and several freshwater species taken from nearby ponds. That kind of detail reveals not only what was eaten, but also the economic value placed on different kinds of fish. One of the most striking points is that sea fish usually outweighed freshwater fish in quantity, even in inland households. Distance from the coast was not an insurmountable barrier. Preserved sea fish moved easily through markets, and even fresh fish reached inland consumers more often than might be expected. A Staffordshire bishop, for example, regularly bought several kinds of sea fish through local markets. Other Midland households also purchased oysters, mussels, haddock, and even porpoise. In some places, the proportion of freshwater fish was still substantial, especially where rivers, fens, or ponds were abundant. But even in inland aristocratic diets, sea fish often appeared in larger numbers. Freshwater fish mattered not because it replaced sea fish, but because it complemented it. In value, however, freshwater fish could equal or exceed sea fish, despite being consumed in smaller quantities. This reflects the high prices placed on pond fish and certain river species. A single pike, tench, or bream could be worth a surprising amount. These were not cheap substitutes for meat. They were luxury items, and their value rested partly on scarcity, partly on the labour needed to produce or obtain them, and partly on status. The species most often consumed included eels, pike, bream, tench, perch, and roach, along with salmon. Some of these could be taken from rivers as well as ponds, and local conditions shaped the exact mix. Households in one region might enjoy trout, dace, chub, or grayling from local waters, while those in East Anglia had access to other species from fenland fisheries. Carp, which later became famous pond fish, arrived only in the late 15th century and took time to become important. These patterns also show how fish were supplied. In theory, a great household might have tried to rely on its own estates, moving from one residence to another, while drawing on local ponds and fisheries. In practice, the system was more complicated. By the 14th and 15th centuries, aristocratic households tended to stay longer in favoured residences, and fish often had to be transported from distant manors. Lords and bishops drew fish from ponds many miles away, and the royal household operated an especially elaborate system in which written orders sent fish across the country to wherever the court happened to be. Even households that owned ponds still bought a significant share of their freshwater fish on the market. As domain assets were leased out more often in the later Middle Ages, reliance on purchase increased further. That market in freshwater fish was substantial. Wealthy townsmen, eager to imitate aristocratic tastes, depended entirely on it. Lords sometimes sold surpluses from their own ponds, but more often fish ponds and river fisheries were farmed out to tenants who sold most of the catch. Some of these fish were handled by specialist dealers, including traders known specifically for selling pike or other freshwater species. London formed the largest centre of demand, but provincial markets, especially places like Cambridge with access to fenland resources, also played major roles. River fisheries could be highly productive, yet even here only a small fraction of the catch might be reserved for the lord's household, with the rest sold or preserved. The prices paid for freshwater fish reveal just how strong demand had become. Small river fish could sometimes be bought cheaply enough for poorer people to afford them, and there is evidence that peasants did occasionally eat fish they caught themselves. Local trade in river fish could be lively, especially in fenland towns and villages, so freshwater fish was not completely beyond the reach of the lower orders. But the larger and more desirable fish were costly luxuries. A mature pike in the 15th century could cost as much as a skilled craftsman earned in a week. A tench worth several pence represented the value of dozens of loaves of bread or many gallons of ale. Prices like these make it clear that the choicer freshwater fish belonged mainly to the world of aristocratic consumption. Part of that expense must have come from the nature of fish farming itself. Ponds were labour-intensive, many species grew slowly, and management methods often seem inefficient by later standards. There was clearly room for improvement, as later treatises on fish farming make plain. But economics alone cannot explain the value attached to freshwater fish. Status also mattered. Some species that modern tastes regard as poor eating fetched surprisingly high prices in medieval accounts. That suggests they were prized not just for nourishment or flavour, but for what they represented. Like truffles or caviar in later elite culture, certain freshwater fish carried prestige. They belonged to a social language of luxury, distinction, and display. The high value placed on freshwater fish can be seen not only in household accounts, or the cost of maintaining ponds, but also in the way fish moved through the world of gifts, favours, and ceremony. In medieval society, food was often used to strengthen relationships, and at the upper levels of that society, the most desirable gifts were rarely everyday necessities. Wine, venison, and game served this purpose, and freshwater fish belonged in the same category. Kings sent fish from their ponds to reward service or show favour. Powerful subjects offered valuable fish to their patrons in hopes of securing support and goodwill. Senior churchmen exchanged notable catches as gestures of respect. Town governments also understood the language of such gifts. When they needed influence, protection, or friendship from a powerful lord or royal officer, they might present fish alongside other luxury foods. The value of such offerings mattered, but so did their symbolism. Freshwater fish were not chosen because they were ordinary. They were chosen because they were prestigious, and because everyone involved understood what they represented. That same prestige made freshwater fish particularly suitable for feasts and special occasions. Everyday fish meals in aristocratic households often relied on more common and less glamorous staples, such as stockfish or herrings. Freshwater species entered the scene most clearly when a household wanted to mark an event, honour a guest, or elevate the meal above the routine. On an important religious feast that happened to fall on a fish day, a host might assemble a table crowded with salmon, eels, trout, perch, dace, pike, and other choice fish, turning the absence of meat into an opportunity for display rather than restraint. The same pattern appears on Christmas Eve, on New Year celebrations that fell on fasting days, and on occasions when distinguished guests arrived. A royal visit, for example, could trigger the special purchase of pike and tench from London markets. Royal households themselves staged even grander fish feasts, drawing supplies from across the kingdom in order to create abundance on a ceremonial scale. Recipe collections from the late Middle Ages reinforce this image. Freshwater fish appear prominently in dishes intended for wealthy establishments and festive occasions rather than everyday use. They were prepared with sharp sauces made from wine, vinegar, onions, and spices, or incorporated into elaborate dishes thickened with rice, almond milk, sugar, and ginger. These were not humble meals. They were carefully constructed displays of taste, wealth, and refinement. Even when freshwater fish were served in smaller amounts on ordinary fish days, the social division at the table remained clear. The better species went to the high table, to the lord, the gentry, or the more honoured members of the household. Servants were fed in quantity, but with cheaper preserved fish. The difference was not hidden. It was part of the social meaning of the meal. Food in general cannot be separated from the society that produces and consumes it, and freshwater fish make that especially clear. Eating is never only about nourishment. It also expresses status, access, hierarchy, and cultural values. Anthropologists have often observed that sophisticated cuisines flourish most fully in societies with strong social distinctions, and medieval England fits that pattern very well. Fish ponds were not only practical sources of food, they helped define the physical and symbolic separation of the aristocracy from the rest of society. Many lay behind park boundaries, beside moats, or within restricted precincts. They belonged to landscapes designed to exclude. Like parks, warrens, and hunting rights, they were tied to privilege. The ability to possess and enjoy these resources marked a social boundary as much as an economic one. That helps explain why attacks on ponds and parks in the 14th century should not be dismissed as simple theft. Repeated assaults on these enclosed resources may also be read as challenges to privilege itself. When large groups descended on a lord's park, took deer, and stole fish in quantity, the act carried more than material meaning. It struck at something the aristocracy valued not only for its utility, but for its exclusiveness. Fish, like game, had become part of the language of power, and to take them unlawfully was to violate more than property. It was to break through a visible social barrier. Freshwater fish also helped define distinctions within the aristocracy itself. Ownership of a well-stocked pond was one of the signs of entry into a refined and elevated way of life. That is why literary observers could use such details to expose ambition and social climbing. A prosperous man of non-gentle birth who maintained ponds full of bream and pike was doing more than feeding his household. He was adopting the outward symbols of aristocratic living. In the later Middle Ages, such gestures became increasingly charged, as older elites grew more conscious of wealthy newcomers rising from below. The leasing out of domain and ponds, and the increasing ability of rich peasants or townsmen to acquire and manage resources once controlled by lords, threatened to blur older distinctions. Some of these men profited from fish sales and enjoyed some of the consumption patterns, once more exclusive to the landed elite. Yet the symbolic power of freshwater fish did not disappear. They remained markers of distinction well beyond the medieval period. The text then turns from fish to gardens, another feature of medieval life whose real importance is often difficult to measure. Modern England is full of enthusiasm for gardens, and that enthusiasm has sometimes encouraged a view of the past in which horticulture seems larger and more central than it really was. A colder look suggests that medieval gardening mattered a great deal to daily life and comfort, but not because it dominated the economy. Gardens are difficult to study precisely because they were so ordinary. Many people had access to them, and for that reason they often passed without detailed comment. Gardening usually required little cash, little formal accounting, and little administrative attention. It belonged to the domestic economy, to routine consumption and everyday maintenance. And because of that, it often disappears into the gaps of the record. Language makes the problem worse. Medieval people used a wide and imprecise vocabulary for gardens, orchards, enclosed plots, and the attached land around houses. The same word could cover spaces containing grass, fruit trees, herbs, vegetables, and small enclosures of various kinds. Terms that seem more specific can still be frustratingly vague. The result is that gardens often hide behind broader words for enclosures, crofts, curtilages, and messuages. Even their products are hard to pin down. A single word for herbs, fruit, or leeks might cover many different species. That vagueness reflects the everyday nature of horticulture. It was familiar enough that people often saw no need to define it carefully. By almost any measurement, medieval gardening remained small in scale. In many regions, gardens may have occupied no more than 1 or 2% of the productive land. The cash income they generated was tiny. Very few people worked in horticulture full-time, and the internal trade in garden produce was so limited that documents mention it only rarely. Compared with grain, wool, meat, and cheese, horticulture was economically marginal. Later centuries, with their larger and more commercial fruit and vegetable production, would increase its importance. But in the Middle Ages, it probably accounted for only a very small share of total agricultural output. Yet this does not mean gardens were unimportant. Their significance lay less in quantity than in quality. They improved daily life, diversified food, provided useful produce close at hand, and offered spaces of leisure, control, and display. For lords, the garden was also a statement. It formed part of a visible language of wealth and exclusiveness, much like the pond. Seigneurial gardens were enclosed, sometimes strongly, with walls, moats, hedges, or fences. They were often attached to fortified houses, monasteries, castles, or manorial centres, and in some cases they lay within or beside parks. These were not just places of production. They were also settings for leisure, refinement, and the performance of status. A lord or lady might take personal pleasure in the management of a garden, treating it almost as a cultivated pastime. Yet these gardens were also worked spaces, and in the 13th and 14th centuries, while domain was still directly managed, they could be actively exploited for produce. Most of these gardens were not large. Many were no more than 2 acres, though gardens of 5 to 8 acres were certainly known, and a few much larger examples existed beside major religious or noble centres. In some places there is evidence of expansion during the 13th century, with old gardens enlarged or new ones replacing smaller predecessors. Large gardens commonly stood near residences of real importance, royal and episcopal centres, monasteries, castles, and the houses of major secular lords. Some monasteries maintained several gardens at once, allocating small plots to different officials. On large estates, gardening activity tended to be concentrated selectively, rather than spread everywhere. Only a minority of manors might contain substantial gardens, suggesting deliberate estate policy rather than random local habit. These horticultural arrangements could be closely integrated into wider management. Some estates centralised the production of cider from orchards scattered across several manors. Others designated particular places to supply vegetables, fruit, or even wine. A manor with a large garden might be expected to meet its own household needs, provide vegetables for servants' meals, yield a little cash from sales, and send selected produce to a monastic kitchen or lordly centre some distance away. On large ecclesiastical or lay estates, this reflects deliberate organisation. Smaller landowners, by contrast, often occupied a single residence, and may have supervised gardening more directly. Since some of their gardens were large relative to the scale of their estates, horticulture could represent a more visible proportion of their domestic resources. Judging the profits of gardens in straightforward financial terms is difficult, because direct sales were only part of the story. When manors were given overall cash valuations, the garden often contributed almost nothing noticeable. This is not because it produced no value, but because most of its produce was consumed within the household rather than sold. Larger gardens could sometimes return a modest cash profit, but those sums were tiny compared with the overall income of magnates. Some great gardens yielded only a few pounds after costs, and many probably made no profit at all if labour is calculated honestly. Their justification lay in hidden consumption. They gave the household fresh produce under direct control, and that convenience mattered even when the accounts made the enterprise look unimpressive. The surviving records often create the impression that gardening was intermittent and irregular. A garden might be intensively used for a time, then neglected, grassed over, revived, or partly leased out. Personal interest probably played a major role. Some lords cared enough to maintain active production. Others lost interest or preferred to let parts of the garden to tenants for cash or produce. In many cases, the suspiciously neat sums recorded as the fruit of the garden hint that informal renting arrangements stood behind the figures. Long before lords abandoned the direct management of larger agricultural assets, they were often willing to let gardens pass out of their own hands, either still as gardens or converted into pasture. That again reminds us that the economic weight of horticulture was slight. Gardens mattered, but they mattered as supplements, conveniences, luxuries, and symbols rather than as major engines of wealth. Peasant gardens must have served a much more practical purpose than the carefully enclosed pleasure grounds of the lords. For ordinary rural households, these spaces were not ornaments or symbols of rank. They were useful pieces of land tied directly to survival, comfort, and small-scale independence. Sometimes records mention a distinct plot actually described as a garden, and these were often divided into tiny sections held by different individuals, almost like later allotments. Some were very small indeed. A few may have begun as fragments of old lordly gardens, while others occupied the sites of abandoned houses. But for most peasants, gardening happened within the home plot itself, in the space behind the house, sheds, and animal pens. The size of that domestic enclosure varied from region to region, and this mattered a great deal. In parts of eastern England, where records allow close measurement, the average messuage seems to have covered about half an acre. Further west, the evidence suggests much smaller house plots, often closer to a quarter of an acre. In some places they were smaller still. Only part of that land could be used for horticulture, since the rest was taken up by buildings, yards, access, and space for animals. Barns might stand inside what was technically part of the garden. Fruit trees were often planted not in a separate orchard but along the hedges and boundaries, where every strip of space had to be used carefully. The peasant garden was therefore not a broad and open cultivated area, but a tightly managed patch fitted into the margins of domestic life. These differences in the size of house plots point toward wider regional contrasts in the importance of horticulture. In East Anglia, where peasant holdings were often small, the garden could represent a significant proportion of a family's resources. In Midland villages, where holdings were usually larger, the same amount of garden land formed only a tiny fraction of the total. This suggests that gardening may have mattered more in densely populated regions, where land was scarce, labour was abundant, and cultivation had to be intensive. The link between small holdings and gardening appears again and again in the records. Small plots, specifically called gardens, are very often associated with cottages and humble tenements, But size alone did not determine everything. Climate, soil, closeness to markets, and the structure of the field system also influenced how much gardening developed. It was far easier to grow varied crops in enclosed landscapes than in areas dominated by a rigid, open field system. That is why some parts of western counties, with milder weather, richer soils, enclosed holdings, and good access to towns, show much more evidence of gardens and orchards than more specialised grain and sheep country elsewhere. Even neighbouring villages could differ sharply depending on their local conditions. A rough guide to the importance of gardening can be found in tithe records. When small crops such as apples, onions, flax, and hemp are compared with the great staples like grain, wool, and other main products, the result is clear. Horticulture remained a modest part of the village economy almost everywhere. There were local exceptions, and in some southern districts the proportion could rise noticeably. But in most places, garden produce formed only a small share of total output. Even where it mattered more than usual, it never rivaled the main agricultural foundations of rural life. This confirms the broader picture. Peasant gardens were useful and valued, but they were not the economic centre of the countryside. The crops most likely to appear in the records are flax, hemp, and apples, partly because they were valuable enough to attract attention. Other evidence, especially disputes over trespassing animals, points toward a wider range of produce, though often in a more indirect way. Such cases mention vegetables, fruit, and very often grass. This is revealing. The peasant garden was not necessarily a neat patch packed with vegetables. It often combined several functions. Maintenance agreements made when elderly peasants handed over their holdings in return for support sometimes describe these domestic resources in unusually clear terms. Again and again, what appears is not a specialised vegetable plot alone, but a combination of grass and fruit trees. This makes sense. Peasant households could not ignore the needs of their animals. Livestock mattered for traction, sale, and food, so grazing space was precious. The garden, then, was often a mixed area in which a little grass, a few trees, and some cultivated produce existed side by side. The fruit trees themselves may often have been few in number. In some documented cases, the total seems surprisingly small, perhaps only a handful. Yet even a few trees could matter a great deal. There are occasional glimpses of larger orchards or more substantial fruit yields, but these are not typical enough to overturn the general impression. The important point is that peasants cared deeply about these resources. They fenced and hedged their gardens, defended them in court when animals or neighbours damaged them, and treated them as valuable parts of the holding. Elderly tenants often insisted on retaining a share of the garden or the fruit from a specific tree after surrendering the main holding. Such details speak very clearly. However limited the economic scale of peasant horticulture may have been, these plots mattered intimately to the people who used them. Gardens were not only rural. Some of the earliest recorded examples appear in or near towns, and by the later Middle Ages, urban and suburban gardening had become a familiar feature of English life. Around large towns, and especially around London, broad zones of gardens developed. These served several functions at once. Great aristocratic and ecclesiastical gardens near the capital supplied elite households when their owners came to London for Parliament, royal service, or other business. At the same time, they could profit from the huge demand of the urban market. Around Westminster, Holborn, the Strand, Charing Cross, and the south bank of the Thames, there were concentrations of gardens, unlike anything found elsewhere in the country. Some belonged to nobles and bishops, some to monasteries, some to townsmen. Together, they formed a ring of productive, cultivated land feeding one of the largest concentrations of consumers in England. Large provincial towns also supported horticulture, though on a smaller scale. Monastic precincts might contain major gardens, and local gentry who maintained town houses often kept gardens as well. In many places, the suburbs became the main centres of gardening, partly because there was more space there, and partly because gardens near the walls could supply the town while remaining close to market. Sometimes these suburban gardens became important enough to cause controversy. In one town threatened by war, officials worried that orchards and gardens outside the walls would shelter attackers, and even tried to limit the size of trees. This is an unusually dramatic example, but it reminds us that gardens were not marginal scraps of land. Around towns, they could occupy visible and valuable space. Gardens also existed within towns themselves. The standard urban plot often had enough depth to leave room behind the frontage for some kind of open area. Not every burgage contained a garden, since workshops, privies, sheds and houses competed for the same space, but many did. In shrinking towns of the 14th and 15th centuries, when houses disappeared and plots fell, partly vacant, gardens could spread into areas that had once been built up. Whole districts developed concentrations of adjacent gardens inside the urban perimeter. Small towns in particular could show a surprisingly strong emphasis on gardening. In such places, the distinction between town and countryside is useful. The town itself often had far more gardens than the surrounding villages, and some of these were detached plots rather than just appendages to houses. Their size could be quite substantial by non-seigneurial standards. This suggests that even modest towns stimulated horticulture both within their boundaries and just beyond them. Urban gardening was practiced by many kinds of people. The wealthy might keep larger pleasure gardens, sometimes given names that evoke delight and display. Ordinary craftsmen and traders might cultivate much smaller plots, simply to provide food. Some of these gardens were productive enough to be worth serious protection. Complaints survive from townsmen who claimed large losses when animals broke through fences and destroyed vegetables, herbs, and other produce. Such sums may sometimes have been exaggerated, but not invented. When urban tithes are examined, the results can be striking. Town parishes sometimes produced huge quantities of garlic, onions, flax, and similar crops compared with rural places of similar size. This reflects exactly what might be expected. Heavy market demand combined with abundant labour. Most gardening, however, remained unspecialised. It was done by peasants and townspeople in spare moments, fitted around more important work. The timing helped. Apples, flax, and other garden crops often demanded labour at seasons that did not directly conflict with the grain harvest. In rural society, the earliest specialised gardeners seem to have been peasant tenants, obliged by tenure to work the lord's garden. They may well have descended from older, dependent labourers. By the 13th and 14th centuries, some lords employed regular servants as gardeners, but true specialists remained few. Most seigneurial gardens were still tended mainly by workers who had other duties for most of the year, with some extra help from women, boys, casual labourers, or tenant services. In ordinary gardens, there was little need for advanced skill, and wages reflect this. Only in exceptional cases, especially in prestigious gardens near London or in vineyards, do clearly specialist and better rewarded managers appear. Gardening generally required little capital. The enclosure itself could be costly if it had to be built new, but the tools were cheap, and even the more substantial equipment, like a cider press, represented a limited investment compared with the larger machinery of agriculture. Labour was the main expense. Digging, manuring, weeding, gathering, and especially processing flax and hemp demanded time and hands more than cash outlay. The methods used are hard to reconstruct in detail, but the range of crops in many places seems fairly narrow. Common vegetables probably included onions, garlic, leeks, cabbage, peas, beans, and parsley. Fruits included apples, pears, cherries, plums, grapes, nuts, and related produce. Yet the range widened noticeably in urban and especially elite gardens near London, where a much more varied horticulture appears. Archaeology confirms that some vegetables scarcely mentioned in documents were in fact grown and eaten. In theory, gardening ought to have been one of the most intensive forms of cultivation in medieval England. There are hints that this was sometimes true. Some crops were sown densely. Manure seems to have been used heavily, and gardeners developed techniques such as grafting that required care and knowledge. High rents for some gardens, especially in towns, also suggest that they could be valuable pieces of land. But the picture is mixed. Much evidence points in the opposite direction, toward underuse and loose management. Even large urban gardens were sometimes partly laid down to grass, and some famous plots were used at times for grain rather than specialised produce. Gardening was potentially intensive, but it was not always so in practice. As labour became more expensive and landlords withdrew from direct management, in the later Middle Ages, gardens were often leased out. In London, this helped create a new kind of entrepreneurial gardener. Such men probably had always mixed service to a lord with independent trade. But once the great gardens were rented out, they became more visible as commercial producers in their own right. They paid substantial rents and sold peas, cherries, vegetables, and other produce in urban markets. Some of their profits also came from seed and plant sales. Again, towns were central. Onion seed, leek seed, young plants, young trees, and hedging stock were all bought and sold, often in urban markets. Flowers, vegetables, and fruit found ready customers there. The marketing of garden produce was a small trade, but it existed at several levels. At the top end, fruiterers supplied richer consumers in London and other big towns. At the bottom end were hucksters, carrying produce in baskets through the streets, often poor people, especially women, living by a precarious and seasonal trade. Some came in from nearby villages. Others were settled dealers, known by names tied to the products they sold, such as garlic sellers and leek sellers. Still, this world remained modest compared with the far larger trades in bread, ale, fish, cheese, or poultry. Garden produce was too cheap to generate huge fortunes. Apples were cheap beside wheat. Cider was cheaper than ale. Onions sold at ordinary rates, only special varieties, luxury fruit, or desirable early produce like green peas could command really impressive prices. This helps explain both the small profile of horticulture in commercial records and the steady attraction of imported produce. England continued to import onions, garlic, dyes, hemp, cabbages, seeds, and later hops, which suggests that local horticulture did not fully satisfy demand. It is sometimes claimed that medieval people of all ranks ate very large quantities of fruit and vegetables. That view is difficult to sustain. Household accounts, where they survive, suggest rather limited and irregular consumption, especially among the elite. Large institutions might receive impressive totals of garlic or apples over a year. But once these quantities are divided among all the consumers, the daily amount per person shrinks sharply. A great household staying for long periods in one residence would have strained even a substantial garden. Yet detailed elite accounts rarely show major purchases of fruit and vegetables. The explanation seems to be not that such foods were consumed in abundance, but that they were not regarded as central. Elite cuisine remained overwhelmingly focused on meat, fish, and spice-rich dishes. Fruit and vegetables appeared in recipes and some dishes were built around them, but they were not the foundation of aristocratic eating. Fresh produce was often associated with poverty, simplicity, or even penitence. Some people distrusted raw green food as unhealthy. Among the upper ranks, garden produce tended to appear seasonally, especially in Lent or as a treat in early summer or at Christmas. Certain fruits and vegetables could also function as delicacies or gifts. Strawberries, peascods, apples, pears, and cherries might be valued not because they were nutritionally essential, but because they were seasonal, desirable, and suitable for presentation. Town authorities could offer them to distinguished guests, just as they offered other luxuries. In ordinary budgeting for travel, provisioning, and military expeditions, fresh produce was far from central. This strongly suggests that garden products, though appreciated, were not seen as indispensable staples. Poorer people, by contrast, probably relied on them more. Their basic diet still rested on bread, porridge, and ale, but the garden gave useful additions. Servants on manors, who came largely from the poorer peasantry, received pottage in which vegetables from the Lord's garden played a regular if poorly documented part. Peasant cooking must have followed the same general pattern. Garden crops provided flavour, variety, and some nutritional support. They could also be especially valuable at hard moments. Village bylaws sometimes allowed the poor to gather green peas during the hungry weeks before harvest. And such rules make sense only if these foods really mattered. The evidence that survives suggests that peasant households with orchards might at least secure a modest, regular supply of cider and fruit. These were not grand luxuries, but useful supports in an uncertain economy. Towns stood at the centre of both production and consumption. This was partly because aristocratic and wealthy buyers came into towns expecting to find whatever they needed there. It was also because many urban inhabitants lacked direct access to a garden and therefore depended on the market. In addition, urban life seems to have encouraged more varied tastes. Archaeology has produced especially vivid evidence here. The contents of medieval drains, cesspits, and latrines reveal not only the expected remains of cereals, but the stones, pips, and seeds of many fruits: apples, pears, plums, cherries, grapes, damsons, gooseberries, strawberries, and also wild fruits, such as blackberries and sloes. The picture is one of variety rather than monotony. Yet even this evidence has limits. It cannot show exactly who ate these fruits or how often. A cesspit may represent many months or years of use. Still, it suggests strongly that urban consumers, or at least some among them, enjoyed a broader range of plant foods than the written record alone would imply. Towns also encouraged demand for industrial crops grown in gardens, especially flax, hemp, teasels, and dye stuffs tied to textile production. This reminds us again that the medieval garden was not only about pleasure or even food. It was a flexible, practical, and often underestimated part of everyday life. Its economic scale was small, but its uses were many. For peasants, it provided useful additions to the household economy. For townspeople, it could offer food, profit, and market opportunities. For lords, it expressed refinement, control, and selective consumption. Medieval horticulture never dominated the landscape, but it threaded itself through domestic life, social difference, and local exchange in ways that made it much more significant than its small acreage might suggest.